All right, so it's not exactly halfway through spring camp. Yesterday was practice number 7 for the Pitt football team out of, I guess in some sense you could consider it the halfway point because they have 14 practices and then the spring game. In total, it makes for 15 practices. But if you separate the spring game and say that's not really a practice, that's a different kind of thing where they don't run any of the offense and they don't run any of the defense and they mix up all the roster, the first team and second team and all this. If you set that one aside, they're halfway through spring camp. If you want to consider the Blue Gold game as one of the 15 practices, which the NCAA does, and then you would say that they are, I guess halfway. Once they reach the halfway point of Thursday's practice, they will be halfway through spring camp. But either way, I think it's close enough that we can call it the midpoint of spring camp or halfway through spring camp. Time is flying with this spring camp as Pitt is already in week number 3. They've got 2 full weeks after this, plus a couple practices this week before things all wrap up. So I figured since we're at this point, sort of a midpoint of spring camp, what have we learned so far? What stood out through the first 2.5 weeks of spring camp? What stood out through the first 7 practices? One of those was a scrimmage, which they held on Saturday, and then the others were all sort of regular practices. The media was there for most of those, at least the opening 45 minutes or so. So we got to see a little bit. We've got some observations based on what we've seen, some observations based on what we've heard, what we've been told, and what we've kind of learned about this team so far. So halfway through spring camp, what's standing out about the Panthers? What's most notable? What have we learned this spring? Let's talk about it here on the Tuesday edition of the Morning Pitt. YouTube.com/Panther-Lair.com. Yeah, a bit of a different schedule for Pitt this week. They've gone Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday is sort of their regular schedule. It's what they did the first 2 weeks. It's what they'll do the last 2 weeks. And it's what they initially planned to do this week, but they changed the schedule because today is actually the funeral for Mason Alexander, the Pitt freshman who passed away the week before spring camp. He was at home in Indianapolis for spring break, passed away in a car accident. Pretty sad and tragic event. Today is the funeral. Yesterday there was a viewing. Today's the funeral. Pat Narduzzi and a lot of the coaches went out yesterday for the viewing, intended for most of the team. I think Pat Narduzzi said yesterday maybe about 60 players are going to make the trip in addition to coaches and support staff. Anyone really got to know Mason Alexander well enough to feel like they wanted to go out and be there for this event. So they were supposed to practice today, move that practice to yesterday so they could accommodate that trip and make that trip out to Indianapolis. They'll all be back in town, I presume, later tonight because tomorrow's pro day when former Pitt players, the seniors, the guys who are out of eligibility or going to the NFL or trying to go to the NFL will work out for NFL scouts. So we'll talk a little bit about that tomorrow. We can talk about pro guys and maybe even talk about it on Thursday. Kind of recap. Jim will be there at Pro Day. We'll talk with him tomorrow night on the live show about what he saw and what stood out, who worked out well, who impressed the scouts, and maybe helped their NFL draft stock. We'll talk about all that stuff. But so a little bit of a change in the schedule, but they had practice yesterday. That was the first practice since Saturday's scrimmage, which was the first live scrimmage of spring camp. Pat Narduzzi said the first team and second team got about 45 snaps each, which is actually a little bit light or a little bit on the lighter side of what they typically do. I would think he said they'll get more snaps in the scrimmage this Saturday. And so we'll see what comes out of that. But the biggest thing that came out of this past Saturday's scrimmage is that there were a lot of turnovers. Now, a lot of times, Pat Narduzzi pretty much says it every time they have one of these scrimmages, whether it's in spring camp or training camp. And there's a lot of truth. I understand why he does it, but they decide who wins, offense or defense, based on like a scoring system. And obviously, the offense is going to get points for touchdowns, they get points for first downs and things like that. And then the defense is going to get points for tackles for loss, sacks, and most importantly, turnovers. And the turnovers are really what usually decide these scrimmages. It's very rare that the offense protects the football and loses the scrimmage, which obviously the point being that if you go into most games and protect the football, you'll probably have a good chance to win. Or conversely, if you go into most games and turn the ball over too much, you're going to lose. And so in an effort to mimic game conditions and mimic or really hammer home the point about ball security, this is how the coaches set it up. And so they came into spring camp with the offense wearing the blue jerseys, the defense wearing the white jerseys, and that's sort of a, they put a lot of stock into that. The coaches put a lot of meaning on that. The blue jersey is for the side of the ball that's been doing well, doing better, playing better. And they're usually decided by games or scrimmages. And so they started spring camp with the offense in blue and the defense in white. Sure enough, in yesterday's practice, the offense was in white and the defense was in blue. The blue jersey's going to the winning team because the defense won the scrimmage on Saturday, largely on the strength of about 5 interceptions and 1 fumble, according to Pat Narduzzi. And there's a lot that we can dig into that. There's a lot we can ask about that. I asked Pat Narduzzi, I said, well, is that a product of mistakes on the part of the offense or just your defensive guys making plays? And he said, from his view, it was more about, the turnovers were more, as he said, giveaways than takeaways, which, sort of says the offense was making mistakes, bad throws, poorly run routes, and the defense was able to capitalize. It wasn't necessarily that the defense was out there getting tons of plays. They obviously had to make the plays when the opportunity presented itself, but it wasn't. It was more about offensive miscues than defensive excellence or something like that. So what do we read into that? Well, largely, we read into it that it was the first scrimmage of spring. And, one of the oldest cliches in football is that defense starts faster than offense. Defense is reacting. Defense is attacking. And, these are drills that are going live where the offense is sort of getting hit for real for the first time. And you've got a real pass rush, even though the coaches will blow the whistle before the pass rushers ever get to the quarterback. But you've got that real pressure getting enacted, whichever one would be the right word there, for the first time. And, sometimes it can be a little bit tougher for the offense to respond to that, at least that first time. More often than not, what we've seen over the years, and this is really literally over the years, and you can go back through the first 10 years of Pat Narduzzi, you can go through Paul Chryst years, Todd Graham's year, Dave Wanstead's years. As long as I've been covering Pitt, they've had these scrimmages in the spring and in the summer, and it usually starts off with the defense being better and playing better than the offense. By the second scrimmage and certainly by the third, things have more or less evened out. The offense is caught up and sometimes might even be ahead of the defense. It's very rare that you open one of these camps in the first scrimmage, the defense gets outplayed by the offense. So there's not a lot to read into there. You'd like to see the quarterbacks do a better job taking care of the ball and not putting it in jeopardy. But as Narduzzi pointed out yesterday, some of that's going to be due to wide receivers maybe not running their route well, not getting the right depth, not getting to the right markers that they're supposed to be at, which is going to be a factor in the quarterback and where he throws it and whether the ball is going to be catchable for the offense or for the defense. So I'm not going to overreact too much to a preponderance of turnovers in the first scrimmage of spring. And in fact, on the contrary, I'm actually going to stay a little bit optimistic and a little bit positive about the quarterbacks, because the thing that stood out to me yesterday as I was watching practice, and I wrote about this in our practice report on Panther-Lair.com. So, if you're watching this thing late Monday morning, you could have read me writing about this like 24 hours ago. But one of the things that really stood out to me is that, I just bumped the table and the whole thing shook. One of the things that really stood out to me is that this might be the most athletic collection of quarterbacks I can remember seeing at Pitt in a long time. And I'm not really sure what the other reference point would be. I'd have to go back kind of year by year and look at the quarterbacks that they had. But this group this year, with Eli Holstein, Julian Duggar, and Mason Heinschel, they're about as athletic as you're going to get. I think for collectively, there might, Kenny Pickett was a pretty athletic guy, but you didn't have 3 of them, 3 guys who had as much athleticism as this group. And I mean, Eli Holstein, we've seen him play. I think we've seen him run and make plays on the run enough to believe in his athleticism. You remember a year ago, or when he was transferring to Pitt, there were reports that Alabama had wanted him to move to tight end. Now, I don't know if that was true or not. You hear different things depending on who you ask, but I think what we saw last season is that he's athletic enough that it seems plausible they could want him to play tight end. Like, he probably could catch the ball and run well after the catch. So we know he's got that athleticism to run, to make plays on the run, to throw on the run, and just generally not be a statue, right? Julian Duggar, we know, has that athleticism as well. You saw it at Penn Hills, although not as much as I would have expected. And I always thought it was remarkable that he didn't, use that athleticism more, didn't run more at Penn Hills, because it seems like such a weapon for him. He definitely did in the bowl game when he played. And and then watching him yesterday throwing while he's on the move. I mean, he's got great body control. He's a bigger guy. He's the tallest quarterback they've got. He's got great body control. He can roll out of the pocket, and he can throw pretty comfortably down the field while he's on the move, which is a pretty good testament to athleticism. And then Mason Heinchel is a guy who in high school referred to himself as an improviser. He's a guy who could get out of the pocket, run around, make plays like that. And so he's got that athleticism as well. And again, you could see it just in some of the drills that we get to watch during spring camp. You could see the way he throws. And that's one of the other things that stand out to me about these three guys is, I mean, they throw the ball really well. I can remember a few years ago, like spring camp, probably 2023 when they went 3-9. And like Phil Dracovic was throwing some pretty nice deep passes. Christian Veyer was throwing some pretty nice deep passes. Nate Yarnell was doing a decent job. And I remember looking at it and just being like, wow, these guys, they're not always really accurate, but the ball looks really pretty in the air. I don't know if Holstein, Duggar, Heinchel collectively has the arm strength that Dracovic and Veyer and Yarnell collectively had. But I think they have strong enough arms. I think they throw the ball well enough. They have good accuracy. And one of the drills I was watching yesterday was sort of a, I don't know if you want to call it a gold zone drill or something like that, where you're around the 35 or 40 yard line. And they were throwing a bunch of different routes from this spot, but some of them were throws into the end zone. And those guys were just dropping it in a bucket every time. And, sometimes the receivers didn't track the ball well or didn't get under it, but the receivers who knew what they were doing, like the older guys, the guys who are a little bit more experienced, were able to get downfield, find the ball, and track it, and catch it in stride. And they were really nice throws. So, I mean, I'm pretty bullish on this quarterback group. I'm still pretty bullish on Eli Holstein. And if something happens to him, that they have to go to Julian Duggar, I'm pretty bullish on that prospect. And then I'm pretty bullish on Mason Heinchel and his future and his potential. So it's an athletic quarterback group, and it's a group that I think has a chance to be pretty good this season and beyond. The guys blocking for them, of course, are going to be a big question mark, and that's been something we've watched all spring. Certainly have been a point of emphasis, a real focal point for us. And, one of the biggest things, and I've written about this a couple times, I think I probably talked about it, is that they're just slim. Like they particularly the returning guys look like they have lost weight and just look like they're in better shape. Ryan Baer is the one who stands out the most. He is just remarkably thinner than he was at any point in his career. According to him, it's the lightest he's been since his junior year of high school. I mean, these guys have slimmed down, presumably gotten in better shape, improved their conditioning, and and that's the returning guys. And then I think that the new guys sort of fit in there well, too. Kendall Stanley was a guy who stood out to me yesterday. Again, he's a little bit thinner, but he can really get out and run. And I was watching him go through some drills, working a tackle, and just getting downfield pretty smoothly. Pretty smooth for a guy his size. And I mean, he's not small. He might be a bit thin for an offensive lineman, but I mean, he's still a big guy. He's still probably like 280, 290 pounds or something like that. If you're that size and you can run down the field well, that bodes well for a lot of things, I think. And I think this offensive line overall just physically looks like they're in better shape than last year. Not that last year looked like a bunch of fat guys, fat slobs out there, slugging around on the field. That's not what I mean to say, but I do think this year's group looks like they're in pretty good shape. And you throw in, so you have the size. There's some position versatility there. Like I said, Stanley can play either tackle spot. We know Bear has played both tackle spots. I think different guys can move around to different positions, so you've got some versatility that should help build the depth. And then you've got experience. You've got the guys coming back like Lyndon Cooper and BJ Williams and Ryan Baer, not to mention the guys who got some of their first real experience last year with Terrence Enos and Isaiah Montgomery and Jackson Brown. But then you throw in Kendall Stanley, who's been a starter. You throw in Keith Gouveia, who's been a starter. You throw in Jeff Percy, who's played a ton at Michigan. You've got a lot of experience in this group. I really think they're going to be better than they were a year ago. I think they're going to be better prepared for an injury than they were a year ago. And I think overall they should just be a better unit. You know what I mean? I think you should get more effective play out of the offensive line than you did a year ago, which would be huge. Which would be huge for this offense, of course. The one other thing that I would mention, I would probably go to on the defensive side. I was going to talk about this position or that position. We can get into individual positions, but the one thing I've really noticed is like you've got a few guys who are the cream rising to the top in terms of playmaking ability. I've often talked about and written about these takeaway stickers that they put on the helmets. Where the guys. Defensive players, if they get a turnover in practice or in a scrimmage or wherever it might be, you get a sticker on your helmet. It says takeaway, and it's a very sort of tangible way of accounting for who's making plays because you get one every time you make one. And like last summer, I think Cruz Brookins had about 8 of those things. That was just the kind of camp he was having. Well, he's carried that over to spring camp too. Cruz Brookins after 6 practices, I should say, so prior to yesterday, because yesterday was practice number 7, after 6 practices, Cruz Brookins had 4 of those takeaway stickers on his helmet. Kyle Lewis had 4 of those takeaway stickers on his helmet. A couple other guys had 2, a few guys had 1, but Lewis and Brookins were at the top, and Brookins actually told us after practice yesterday he's got he called it a running bet, but they didn't say anything's really at stake. I think it's just like a competition of who can get the most. And it's funny, they don't really seem to consider anybody else even in the competition. It's Brookins or it's Lewis, and understandably so. Those guys are probably the top playmakers on this defense, along with like Rasheem Biles. And they're doing it so far. You know what I mean? That's the thing. Lewis and Brookins are making those plays so far in spring camp with 4 takeaways each. There's something to be said for having playmakers on defense. And Pitt has had playmakers on defense over the years. Rashad Weaver and Patrick Jones were playmakers. MJ Devonshire had a flair for the dramatic. I think what we've seen in the last year is the real evolution of the linebackers as playmakers, which wasn't really the case. Honestly, like 2015 with Matt Galambos and Mike Cabrera might have been like the most playmaking in terms of getting turnovers, getting interceptions and sacks and fumbles out of the linebacker core that we've seen under Narduzzi up until last season, when it really, I think the position really blossomed with those guys, with Lewis and Biles and Braylon Lovelace. Brandon George did a nice job. And, George is gone, but you got Lewis and Biles and Lovelace back for this year. You're adding in some promising young guys to sort of fill out that rotation. But you've got playmakers there. And more than you've had at linebacker probably ever, outside of last year. Defensive backs, I think, Paris Ford, it sometimes felt like all or nothing with him, but when it was all, it was some of the most exciting stuff we've seen out of any Pitt player. Like he was really good at being a big impact player. Now, he also made a lot of mistakes that gave up big impact plays to the other team. But he was pretty sensational. When it was, when he made some of those plays. But I feel like, this year they've got guys emerging as real playmakers. You're going to need playmakers to emerge up front. That's going to be one of the biggest tests for this defense, and one of the things that can really determine how good this defense can be is whether they can get pressure out of the front 4. But you've got playmakers at linebacker. With Cruz Brookins at safety, you've got some playmaking ability there. The corners, we'll see what emerges with Rashad Battle and Tamon Lynham and Shadarian Harrison and Rashawn Murray. I think they've got some guys who have the potential to do it. But what we've seen so far in spring camp is that the guys you would probably expect to be making a lot of plays, Kyle Lewis, Cruz Brookins, they are. And that's what you like to see, right? You have expectations. You expect certain guys to be among your best players. But they don't always live up to it, right? They don't always meet those expectations. Well, so far in spring camp, those two, who I think there are high expectations for, they're living up to it, which is a good thing. All right, those are a few things that have stood out so far. We got a lot more Pitt stuff to talk about this week. We're going to talk about, we'll get into some pro day stuff. We'll talk about college basketball transfer portal because that is heating up and there is a lot to talk about there. And then, of course, on Friday, we'll have the mailbag. So I'm actually going to put up a post today asking for questions for the Morning Pitt mailbag. So go to the message boards at Panther-Lair.com on the 247 Sports Network. You can look for the post probably later today on the Between Fifth and Forbes message board, asking for questions for the mailbag. If you have something you want to ask about Pitt football, basketball, recruiting, or anything else on your mind, put your question there, and we will answer as many as we can on Friday. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. We'll have another Morning Pitt, of course, for you tomorrow morning. We'll have the live Panther-Lair show tomorrow night. We look forward to that every Wednesday night, and more Pitt stuff for you throughout the week. So like and subscribe. Check out the website, Panther-Lair.com. Have a great Tuesday, and we'll catch up with you tomorrow for the Morning Pitt right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.